John McMullen at JF McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. He joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. I guess in that call with the president over the weekend, John, of all the sports that got any decent news, the NFL seemed to be the only one that was like, hey, that was a very productive call on Saturday, right?
Yeah, it's funny how the NFL gets good news. I mean, this league is too important for its own good, and I say that in a couple ways. I mean, obviously, there's so much uncertainty. No one can guarantee anything, but it's pretty evident everybody wants to make sure everything is back in place and as close to normal as possible by week one of the NFL season, which is, let's be honest, it's bizarre how much. But I talk about it all the time when we, before this, and when there would be, I don't know, cultural questions and people would bring it up and they'd use the NFL as some kind of measuring stick, some kind of moral compass. I would tell people, what is wrong with you? Why are you defining societal changes, society and cultural meanings from a sports league, which at its core is an entertainment vehicle designed to make money. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. And not enough people realize that, to be perfectly honest.
Well, the whole thought process for a fan to say that the leagues are here as an entertainment avenue, I think bothers fans sometimes who think competition is not supposed to be entertainment first. It's supposed to be a competitive venue.
Well, it can be both. I mean, it is competitive, and we talk about wrestling sometimes and WrestleMania, and that's scripted and scripted entertainment. So I don't think the comparison is that. The comparison is you're fighting for the same disposable income as a distraction, a needed distraction, especially in times like this, for people going through much more important and much more difficult circumstances. I think that's where, personally, my belief comes from. This is, an entertainment vehicle. So if people don't like that word, okay, use whatever word you want, but understand this is not a league or an organization or a conglomerate of organizations you should be looking to make cultural decisions upon or expect them to be the leaders of certain discussions. I mean, that is the part I'm trying to get across.
All right, a couple things I want to get into. Number one, today, I guess Roger Goodell, in a memo sent out all 32 teams, announced that the draft will be conducted entirely outside the facilities and fully virtual, meaning, the head coach is going to be in his house, the GM is going to be in another house. I guess that's the way they're kind of, pitching this, right? That you can't be in the same houses of each other. You're all going to have to be on like a Zoom call, something like that. Has that changed the way that the teams thought they were going to have to do this? They didn't want to do this to begin with. Has this made it even more challenging?
I don't know if it's made it more challenging because there are such technological advances. And again, people I've talked to around the league, including Howie Roseman, who was one of those general managers, everybody's on the same platform. Everybody has the same rules. So as long as it's the same across the board, there's no competitive advantage. It doesn't really matter. And okay, this league has got to have a virtual draft. What is the big deal? It's virtual anyway. Essentially, it's virtual, but it's in one spot, and they make a big deal out of it, and they bring the players in a typical year, and they do all the bells and whistles. But in essence, all you're doing is picking names. You could do that over the phone. You don't even need Zoom. So, I do think people are, again, because it's the NFL, they're putting so much stock into everything.
I think it's
the draft.
I think it's also the view of the draft is from the television entity that we know, and they're trying to view how this all goes down without the television aspect of it, which is also going to potentially have a little bit of a tweak and a change.
Well, yeah, and that's the issue, obviously, and I talk about it all the time. Television revenue drives this sport, drives every sport, and you have to make them happy. So you do have to have a television part of it, and that's where the virtual part, whether it's Zoom or FaceTime or any other vehicle to where everybody, you've seen it on the talking head shows already. You've done it with the radio show, and you guys have been in different spots doing the show, essentially virtually. People, whether they're doing it in a fashion where they have their own personal cameras or it's a conference call or whatever. I mean, they're doing late night talk shows in that fashion where Jimmy Fallon is from home. So, I mean, if that can be done, you can do a draft over FaceTime or Zoom.
Well, you wonder if the draft will be shortened because there's no players to interview, or I guess you can still interview the players, but now
they're still inviting 50 players. That's what they usually do in a virtual sense. So those 50 players you always pay attention to because that's the ones that NFL scouts think are going to go really high in the draft. So we all know top 10 picks and top 15 picks. But once you start getting down to that 45, 50 range, there could be a surprise or two that NFL scouts think more of than in the media or these YouTube scouts or these online scouts. So you always pay attention to that. And they're still doing it. It's just they're not going to be in Las Vegas. They're going to be in their own homes on those calls, on those Skype calls.
Apparently the draft might have a different look. This is interesting, John. I know for the sports media geek in me that ESPN and the NFL Network might be doing a combined draft, which I think will be kind of interesting to see. Who's hosting the draft? Do you get Mel Kiper? Do you get the NFL? Who's it? Daniel Jeremiah?
Daniel Jeremiah,
right.
Yeah.
Have you heard much about how the look of this broadcast could go?
No, and we'll see. I mean, all of it's kind of fluid. I mean, they just got a lot of teams have been prepping to do sort of I forget which team had set up at a brewery, or New Orleans actually was one that was going to do it together at a brewery, and they're not allowed to do that, obviously. So all this stuff is very, very fluid, and the memo from Roger Goodell just came down today saying everybody had to do it virtually from their own homes. So everything kind of shifts. And, I mean, it is – kind of a preference already. Do you like NFL Network? Do you like ESPN? And if you're doing a simulcast, I mean, in some ways they already do that for the Thursday night games, which are the ones that are on the NFL Network. They've kind of pinned them out to where the network does the actual feed and things of that nature. So it's already been done before, simulcast, and those are the things you got to hammer out and say.
Well, what I had read, John, this is from Peter King, which was that the NFL Network's hosts Rich Eisen and Daniel Jeremiah will have prime roles on the show, but they will do it from the ESPN studios because the two NFL studios in Mount Laurel and Culver City are closed because of the state saying they are non-essential, while the ESPN facility is open in Connecticut. So they're going to have the NFL Network guys host the show in the ESPN-produced studio as some sort of compromise to put this on both of the stations who typically air the show. I mean, so you're essentially...
Well, there you have it. Yeah, I mean, if you're shutting down the studio, and obviously I'm very close to Mount Laurel, and everything non-essential has been shut down here, so that kind of answers your question. But I'll also say that, also bring up wrestling again, that can change on a daily basis.
Yes.
by the time this thing rolls around, they might be in the same situation with Connecticut. They might have to go to somewhere else. And I use AEW as an example. They got shut down in Florida. They had to go to Georgia, which was not shut down, to continue taping television. Then Georgia shut down, and they're going somewhere else, and they won't even tell us where they're going because they sort of want to be one step ahead of it if you got to keep churning out this programming. Now, I'm not going to say that's going to happen to the NFL, but when you talk about, what are we today, April 6th to April 23rd, you know, every day in this environment, 50 things happen, and you don't know what's going to happen.
Mm-mm.
So you can plan all you want. You might have to pull the plug on that plan by the end of the week.
Right, which is very interesting, too, considering that Saturday, President Donald Trump told NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell that the NFL season should start on time, to which, you know, the California governor came out and said, I don't know what this guy's talking about, but I don't see our places being ready to play games by that time. So you have a scenario where some of the states are not even, you know, they're not following, well, there's no national guidelines on anything right here. So there can't be the president telling these leagues that you should be ready to play because there's no national guidelines on anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's the United States of America, and each state is its own little fiefdom, and obviously they have different political leaders from different ideologies all throughout the country, and some tend to skew one way, some tend to skew another way, unless there is a federal guideline, which, you know, people can criticize the president, and obviously people like to do that. People love him as well and defend him. You have this divide in this country, but, you know, it doesn't matter what happens. You're going to have 50% of the people upset by it. So that's kind of the situation you're in. If you have a national sort of emergency situation where you declare every single state has to do this, you're going to be sued by multiple states, depending on your ideology.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the situation we're in.
Crazy.
It is a mess, and it's difficult to deal with, to say the least.
No question. And then, John, there is the thought that, you know, be prepared for football games without fans potentially. The Rams have come out and said, well, I don't know that our stadium's going to be ready now because they can't do any work on it during this whole time. So there's a possibility that their home might not be ready, so they might not be able to schedule games there. And then I also read, and maybe you know more about this than I do, but that the schedule makers are coming up with a 12, 14, and 16 game schedule just in case games get pushed back.
Yeah, they are, and it seems like 12 is the floor, the lowest they're willing to go, and that's part of the reason why typically the schedule gets released before the draft, somewhere mid-April, 16th, 17th, somewhere in that range. It's going to be pushed back to early May 7th, May 8th, somewhere in that range. And one of the reasons why is because they're trying to come up with all these contingencies. If they do have to use a shortened schedule, you can imagine how that would throw everything into flux. And you do have those stadium situations. You do have different states that you have to have different bylines, and you have to look into what exactly has to happen, even in a best-case scenario. So, I mean, from a schedule maker standpoint, the guys who put that together and the guys who put the information in the computer, man, I don't envy them.
No, that sounds like a really difficult scenario to have to come up with a bunch of different schedules with the possibility of things changing. I want to get your take on a scenario also that Peter King threw out, which was they're going to expand the playoffs, playing a playoff game on Monday Night Football. Your thoughts on that? Because he said, look, these teams have to play a short week to go to Saturday when they play the Saturday games. So what's different to make a team play on the other side a Monday night game?
Yeah, there's nothing really that different. I mean, teams that do have to play on Saturdays tend to not like it, and vice versa. I've talked about this with Doug Peterson a lot. I mean, and there's some if you get to a second playoff game, sometimes you got to go. The league tries to do the best it can and try to even out things as much as possible. But his thought is, like every coach, you want more. You want that extra day of preparation. You want more preparation. You never want to play on Saturday, especially coming off. It's sort of like that in the regular season as well. Nobody likes it when they play those games late. When you have Thursday games, everybody hates the prep week for Thursday games. It's really difficult to get ready, and then you tend to be banged up late in the season as well. So playing a game on Monday night, when they came out with the new playoff format, they said 3 on Saturday, 3 on Sunday. But, they can change anytime they want, to be honest. And I always talk about who is the ultimate decision maker. It's not Roger Goodell. Does somebody want to pay extensive money to put that game on Monday night? If they do, there'll be a game on Monday night.
Mm-hmm. And there was a report today regarding the Monday Night Football team, which looks like there's a potential for Steve Levy, Louis Riddick, and Dan Orlovsky to take on that role. But there are also some thoughts, too, to go with Chris Fowler and Kirk Herbstreit because, ESPN wants to get in the Super Bowl rotation, but their broadcast team's simply not strong enough.
Yeah, well, that's true. And it's almost like Nate Sudfeld talked to us last week, talking about getting experience. How do you get experience if you're not allowed to get experience? Like Dan Orlovsky is a guy who's opened a lot of people's eyes because he does a good job when he's breaking down things and he's entertaining on television. But how do you get to that situation if the guy never gets a chance? And it's tough. I mean, everybody hopes for Tony Romo and the guy who turns into a star overnight. But, just like in sports where I always say the term generational talent is overused because generational means once in a generation. You're not going to have another Tony Romo for a long time. So, I mean, you almost have to develop guys and try to turn them into stars in the broadcast booth like they would be stars in sports itself. I mean, sometimes you need a ramp-up period.
All right, let me close out with the all-decade 2010s. Eagles have a couple of entrants on there. I was a little – I don't want to say I'm shocked that LaShawn McCoy was on there. I guess I just didn't think of him as an all-decade type of player.
I agree with you. That's the one
when you do a radio interview – like 20 years from now, like when we have Drew Pearson on, you're like, he was a member of the 1970s all-decade team. Like, that sounds like – I don't know that LaShawn McCoy sounds like special, but I don't know. Jason Peters made the list. Who else was on there?
Darren
Sproles made it for 2 different positions, and Fletcher.
Yeah. And the only one I would say that probably should have made it was Jason Kelsey. I think he should have been one of the centers. Mack and Pouncey were the centers. I think Jason was the one who got sort of snubbed. Anybody else, I think it was pretty good. Yeah, except for LaShawn. I don't look LaShawn that way. Maybe you do kind of the last couple years kind of cloud your view. I mean, he was extremely. He was a tremendous player for a long period of time, especially here in Philadelphia, as a dual threat, could run the football, catch it out of the backfield. But yeah, when you look at some of the other names, and Adrian Peterson obviously was the unanimous choice from the running back position. Yeah, it just doesn't have that kind of cachet.
Yeah, by the way, real quick, it was Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Antonio Brown, who's in some more trouble, Larry Fitzgerald, Calvin Johnson, Julio Jones, Gronk, Travis Kelce, Jason Peters, Tyron Smith, Joe Staley, Joe Thomas, the tackles, Jahari Evans, Logan Mankins, Zach Martin, Marshall Yanda are the guards. Alex Mack, Marquise Pouncey were the centers, and then who was the running backs was Frank Gore, Marshawn Lynch, LaShawn McCoy, Adrian Peterson, and then you had Darren Sproles as your flex option there. And then, as you mentioned, the only Eagle that made it was Fletcher Cox. By the way, so I meant to tell you this. So we had Wade Phillips on Thursday's show, and you said to ask about Aaron Donald. But we asked Wade Phillips about who the best – I mean, he had J.J. Watt, Reggie White, Jerome Brown, Aaron Donald, Von Miller. I mean, he couldn't even come up with who the best guy he ever had was.
Well, he's had so many good ones. And you can make, obviously, Reggie White is just unbelievable. And J.J. Watt as well, I think people forget because before the injuries. But I think because of the explosion of Aaron Donald, not necessarily that he's the best. He's just, I've never seen another player like him, just as far as his get off the ball. And it's just, it's almost, like you talk to NFL players about other players, and that's where I get it from. Because if you talk to media people, if you talk to coaches, and you talk to anyone like that, and you say, who's the best receiver in football? They're all going to say Jerry Rice. And by the way, correctly so. But if you ask players, they're going to say Randy Moss because of the explosion, because of the freak athlete. They constantly default to Randy Moss. And that's what Aaron Donald is on the defensive side of the ball. You talk to players about Aaron Donald, opposing offensive linemen, it's like they're in awe of him. That's how much better athletically he is than everybody else. And that's sort of why it's interesting when you talk to players, they have a different mentality. But I did, run off that receiver list again. I had somebody saying Deshaun Jackson should make the receiver.
Antonio Brown.
Like, are you kidding me?
Antonio Brown, Larry Fitzgerald, Calvin Johnson, Julio Jones. No, Deshaun Jackson doesn't bump any of those guys.
Not even in the conversation. That is an amazing receiver group.
Yeah, that's you're not getting in there. And again, I was surprised. I guess the running backs in the 2010s kind of show that the running back kind of started to get phased out a bit because other than Adrian Peterson,
first half of the decade versus last half.
Yeah, I mean Adrian Peterson was Marshawn Lynch was very good, but I don't look at him as an all-decade type of player.
Well, you talk about Adrian Peterson's MVP season. Think about how good he was that year. He was the MVP of the NFL as a running back. And that's how drastically, in less than a decade, that position has changed. That just could not happen in the modern NFL,
By the way,
today's NFL.
The unanimous decisions on defense were J.J. Watt, Aaron Donald, Von Miller, all three coached by Wade Phillips. You know what else he did say, John, that you'll like this? So I said to him, Jim Schwartz gets a lot of flack here that if you took his spot, Eagle fans, would be really excited. And he said, well, I was in Denver, then I got fired, and then I came back the second time, and we won a Super Bowl. So maybe if they bring me back to Philly, well, you fill in the blanks.
Yeah, I mean,
people forget that Wade Phillips was Buddy Ryan's defensive coordinator here.
Yeah. He's one of the best defensive coordinators of all time. I always talk about top five guys, and Jim's a top five guy. When you talk to other coaches around the league, Wade's in that as well. I mean, people can criticize him as a head coach, but he's always been – and I was really surprised. I mean, obviously at his age, and people are always looking for the young up-and-comer, and Sean McVay's there as the offensive mind. But I was really surprised that they moved on because you're not going to do better than Wade Phillips.
Nope, and he's 72 years old. It seems like he was sharp as a tack still. It was funny. I said, well, how'd you hook up with Buddy? And he said, I don't know if you've ever heard this story before, but he said, well, the 1 year I'm with the Saints, we led the league in pass defense, which was the only category they didn't win, and Buddy called me and bitched me out. So when it came time looking for a defensive coordinator, he called me back and said, hey, you beat us in pass defense. Why don't you come join my staff? He's like, I didn't know the guy at all, but he called me and asked me, and I took the job.
Yeah, it was a different world back then, and you didn't have as much off-season work, and guys didn't mingle as much. So you would have those weird stories where, you just look at somebody from afar and say, oh, I like the way he does things. And all of a sudden, you give him a call.
Yeah. Well, you beat me in pass defense this year, so why don't you come on and join us over here? All right, Johnny Mac here on the Sports Bash as we take a look at the NFL. We do each and every day, and we're getting closer to the draft. I'm actually looking forward to this draft for live entertainment, much like the WWE.
Well, you got to. There's no other sport.
Yeah, and I got to be honest.
There's no.
I tried to watch that WWE, and it's not the performer's fault, but the crowd. It just shows you how much the crowd means to the performances.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was. I thought they did a better job than I expected. I went into it, and I said, this is terrible. This is going to be awful. And it was better than I thought it was going to be, and I give them credit for trying some new things. But, yeah, I mean, overall, it gets really, really tiresome with no fans there. And I think the same thing would happen, by the way, if they have baseball games with no fans, football games, basketball playoff games. I think the same thing's going to happen. It's not going to be the same.
Yeah, it was like the Rhea Ripley-Charlotte match, which was an excellent match.
Tremendous.
Both did an excellent job. The problem was they're both very good at selling, and them just screaming. Like, my girlfriend's like, okay, what are you watching over here? But you wouldn't hear that if the crowd was there. You wouldn't hear them just moaning and
Well, that was one of the parts that I found a little bit interesting, because you could hear the performers stay in character and do a better job, because you don't get to hear that when there's 70,000 people there. But, yeah, after a while it gets all – and then you start thinking, how great was that match? And you say it would have been so much better in front of 70,000 people.
Yeah. All right. Did you like the cinematic efforts by The Undertaker and the Firefly Funhouse and that stuff?
I liked the Undertaker match. I didn't like the Firefly Funhouse, although, that to me depends on the person. Some people like that kind of stuff. Matt Hardy was doing that kind of stuff. I don't like it personally, but when you're talking about a 55-year-old guy like The Undertaker, rather than him being in the ring at this stage, that's probably a better way to use him. But as far as guys who can still go athletically, I'm not a fan of that kind of stuff.
All right. Johnny Mac here. Of course, we'll do it again tomorrow here on the Sports Bash Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Thanks, pal.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
All right. John McMullen, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.